Well, thank you, the three of you, very much for your very inspiring, interesting, of course, and very rich share of experience and ideas. So now, as Eva advanced, we are going to reflect on some phrases or statements, and we would like you to particularly share with us what do you think or what comes to your mind about these assertions. Okay, so it's on me, the first one. Well, all of you can see it already, but for you is, we're going to probably afterwards use this order. We start with David, then Richard, and then Ruud, if that's okay for you. So the first one is, this is the assertion: no government is ever going to take the risk of a huge public opposition by giving rights to animals. What do you think about that?
I can talk directly. Thanks very much. So, I mean, I think that assertion, firstly, I think there's something about what Visa said the other day, which is important, which is actually, which is strategically to argue that, well, animals already have some kind of rights, and therefore we're not taking that giant step necessarily of granting sort of new rights necessarily. But I think if we take the argument in terms of thick rights, right, I think which Raphael raised at the beginning of the conference, and I mean, a government isn't going to act against the will of the people, right? So in cases of democratic societies, that does not make sense. The recognition of those kind of thick animal rights has to be a moral development of human society, and then a recognition in law, in my view, must be preceded by a change in our approach to animals more broadly, which is a recognition in human society that animals would be seen as rights bearers. And so the question is, how do we bring that about, right? And there's been a shift in consciousness in some parts of the world, but globalization has also brought about, we heard some of the opportunities that I spoke about, but also a huge amount of ability to shift cruelty. Now, one of the sort of ideas I was just thinking about throughout the conference is this idea. Cass Sunstein developed an idea of what was called incompletely theorized agreements, right? And this is this idea that we don't necessarily, an example from South Africa, all women's groups agreed that there needed to be a right to equality in the Constitution. They did not necessarily agree what the foundation of that right to equality was. What was the underlying philosophical reason for the right to equality? Some people thought it was religious, some people secular. There was a range of differences about it. They also didn't necessarily agree about the implications of the right to equality. There were some conservative women's groups who still thought abortion should be prohibited, and other women's groups who thought, no, we needed to have a permission for abortion. So, but what one created is some kind of intermediate sphere where there was a degree of vagueness around what equality meant, which could allow its development in the future, but around which we could sort of reach agreement. And I think that may be the sweet spot in some senses which we need to find in different societies in different places where we can kind of develop a focus. So I'm not sure government necessarily, so like my own, I think it would be too much of a step to recognize animal rights. Would they recognize something like the intrinsic value of animals and the sort of sentience? Perhaps, and that may open the door, as I said, or create that platform for future development, perhaps, of rights.
Thank you very much. So, Richard?
Well, this, of course, is a very important issue for the future. How far are governments going to go before they run into some sort of opposition? But it won't be from the people. It'll be from the vested interests. And the vested interests may well get very stirred up. I think this is something that really needs a lot of mature consideration. How far can you push people to move before the comeback, as they say today, overwhelms you and you end up worse off than you were to begin with? Well, I mean, at the moment, public opinion in most of Europe and much of America and other places in the world is overwhelmingly strong in favor of the animals. But of course, when you begin to threaten to stop people's access to meat and similar situations, there's going to be all sorts of changes. People are going to suddenly realize that by giving rights to animals, which they'd always agreed with before, they're going to go without their pork chops and their beef steaks. They're going to start thinking again. And it could take 100 years to talk it out, one way or the other. I mean, I feel the way through, or the way forward for the animal welfare movement might be to try and talk to industry, the food industry, about this and say, look, do you want us to go on? Because at the rate we're going, we've proceeded in the last 40 years, for example, you're going to be with some sort of effort to stop the meat industry around the world, or in large chunks of the world. And can we find a way through? I would have thought that what might appeal to the businessman is finding an alternative way of making money other than by selling and breeding animals. It might be to developing alternative forms of food that are even more delicious than beef steak, but without the moral problems attached to it. But they will need time. They will need 50 years, 20 years to begin to think about it. I don't think they're really thinking about it yet. They may be. I hope they are. But in order to avoid a damaging confrontation between those who have vested interests in developing meat and those of us that think it's immoral, the time is now to begin talking to these people about ways in which they can avoid this confrontation that will lose money for all of us. I'm only thinking on my feet. I haven't got a plan very carefully worked out. Maybe I should have done.
Shall I?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So the statement is a bit odd, because no government is ever, you can never say that, right? So and I think we talked over the last couple of days about a couple of examples where governments did, and also in Europe, also if you think about things like including the sentience of animals in constitution. Great steps forward, I think. So the statement is a bit odd in that way, and I fully agree with Richard that the opposition is not going to come from the public. I do not expect large demonstrations with people going on the street and saying, we don't want rights for animals. That's not going to happen. It's if there's going to be opposition, and there will be opposition, then it will be from corporate players, people who have something to lose, and that is what the politicians fear. They don't fear the public opposition. I think at the moment, if I look at the EU that I know best, talking about animal rights at the moment in Brussels is not really. I would not in my first sentence with an MEP, I would not immediately start to talk about rights. I would be very cautious at the moment because again, as I also said in my presentation, at the moment, other things are a priority. Welfare could be a consideration, and is something. And then with welfare, you are talking on some of these areas about rights like outcomes, right? I personally think, but the experts may completely disagree, and I'm not a lawyer. I personally think that a ban on fur farming or a ban on the use of animals in cosmetic testing, that those are going in a direction of rights for animals. Right? So, but and that is still in that area we can still make some progress, I think, at the moment.
Okay, so just to continue a little bit, very shortly, I think you agreed in general, and that the opposition will not come from the citizenship in general, but from some stakeholders in particular, right? Do you have any idea how to overcome that opposition, how to defeat, let's say, because I think it's generalized in the world that animals are part of big industries and or sports or whatever kind of activities that move money. So do you have any idea how to work towards convincing these stakeholders in order to advance? Because they are also powerful politically, I mean. So how do you think you can do it?
Well, we've just done it, actually, in the animal welfare movement in this country, when we've overcome the resistance of those stakeholders who were very much involved with blood sports, with the hunting of animals, with dogs. Not hunting dogs, incidentally. There's a slight misprint in my curriculum vitae. Yes. Anyway, the thing to do, and what I've really done all my active life, is to talk to the people who've really got the power. That is, in a democracy, the politicians. And by the politicians, I mean the very senior politicians. One wants to get at the prime ministers and the presidents and talk to them about this. Show them the evidence from the polls, the pollsters, of the huge public support welling up in support of the animals at this moment, all around the world, it seems. And that, if you can engage a very, very busy prime minister for half an hour looking at a few pictures of how public opinion is swelling in support of the other animals of the globe, that you might get some action in time to begin to, what politicians want, of course. I mean, the amazing thing of working with politicians for the last 50 years is to find out how many of them are thoroughly decent people who want to, yes, who actually want to do good and actually want to help the animals. And they grasp, they seize upon this political and scientific evidence that there is a huge sea of support for animal welfare, and that they might get support politically for doing that. The feeling that, I mean, we started working 30 years ago on trying to persuade British political parties, one or two in this country, to recognize the fact that if they came out in support of some animal welfare measure, they might win 10 extra seats in the next general election. If that can be shown to them scientifically, they might well turn out to be very much more interested than people assume they were. I mean, Brian Davis, shortly before he died, told me the story how he gave dinner. Brian was the person based in America, although of British origin, who had done most to be political with the politicians. He would give a large donation to a president, for example, like, what was his name, president of the Philippines? Can't remember. Who? Who?
Marcos. Marcos.
I can't see. I'm deaf. This is the trouble. I'm awfully sorry. I can't hear. But anyway, you know who it is. He gave a big donation. This is his tactics, and this is really the answer to the question: what do animal welfarists do about this situation? Brian gave his standard donation of £100,000 to the party coffers of Mr. What's his name?
Duterte, was it Duterte or Marcos? I don't know.
Markov?
Marcos.
Oh, Marcos, you see. Okay, sorry, I can't hear. This is the trouble. I'm getting too old too. I mean, he gave the big donation to the party coffers of Marcos, and then invited the president and his wife to dinner. And when they met for dinner, Brown produces a lot of photographs of animals in the Philippines being, in effect, tortured to death, dogs being tortured to death. Now, President Marcos, thank you, yes, Marcos, was absolutely appalled by that, and his wife was even more appalled. And she said to her husband, look, we can't tolerate this. I had no idea this was going on in our country. Stop it. He said, I will, dear, tomorrow. No, do it now. All right, I'll do it now. So he gets his servants, and they bring a sort of thing. And he said, this is a diktat from the president. We must have immediate cessation of hanging of dogs for cooking purposes, for meat purposes. And the chap scurries away, and then Brown reads it carefully, and he sees it's on penalty of death. It's a capital. He made it a capital just by writing that and signing that thing at night. He'd made it into a capital punishment issue. And so he then spent the rest of the meal trying to persuade him to soften it a little bit.
Thank you very much for that.
But you see, that is the classic case of what you want. I mean, it was just beautifully done. And Brian Davis, who sadly died only a year ago, was the great innovator there. I mean, he had a wonderful natural political flair. He'd gone from Wales to live in Canada, and he'd been in the Canadian Army, and then he'd been appalled by the killing of seals in Canada, so he set up that whole battle against the killing of seals. But he was a man with a political genius, and I think we need to do the same sort of thing. It's amazing how sympathetic politicians can be about animals, and how helpful politicians actually want to be if they can be. The thing is to go to the right person. If you went to someone who was number 2 to Marcos, you wouldn't get anything, necessarily. You'd be too terrified of the boss. But
maybe to build a bit on what Richard is saying, and I'll keep it very brief, and to talk about our own experience. It's every situation is different. Every situation, every law is different. The stakeholders are different, and you need to have several tools in your toolbox to make that, to have that impact. And to give you maybe 2 examples. I already mentioned the Save Ralph animation video that created that buzz in Mexico, and everybody was all of a sudden talking about it and getting emotional about using animals for cosmetics, and that gave it that last push. But for example, in Italy on the fur ban, it was an economic analysis that we had done, or had an agency work on that for us, which showed that the fur industry in Italy was actually quite small, and there were not that many fur farmers, and they were doing the job part-time, so it would be relatively easy to phase out of that, where the impression was at first with the politicians, all those farmers, all those that whole industry, it was small. And that was the thing that helped. So it's several things.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Thank you very much. And another good takeaway is the power of Imelda de Marcos. Besides the quantity of shoes that's like a myth about it. So, Eva, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add briefly. I think you were raising a question of, because really it's about corporate power and how do we manage corporate power, and that's really difficult. I mean, one of my is business and human rights, but I think in the sphere, so I think we need to also think about corporate obligations in the sphere. We need to think about various issues of directors' duties. We need to think about the opportunities in corporate law. duties of reporting. I mean, I'm not sure. I know the EU has extensive reporting requirements, for example, on fundamental rights. What are the reporting requirements in relation to animals? And so I think issues of transparency, for instance, the levers that we have in some ways in relation to corporations are, I mean, you know, they're like the slave holders, and they're not going to necessarily give up their slaves, right? You know, to use, but what you need to almost is spotlight what's going on, and that can, in a sense, assist in that. They don't want to show up what many of them are doing. So if we can kind of remove the barriers in a way to transparency, and I was having with Tim over breakfast a discussion about access to information laws, and I think these are kind of opportunities if we can stop shielding corporations from exposure in some sense of what's going on, that can also create a foundation of pressure on them to shift.
Yeah, that's super. Well, we have to go for the break now. I'm sorry we are entertaining you. Thank you very much for coming back shortly. So now we are going to pass to our second half of this little block. We're going to do some questions, general questions for you, the three of you, that you will have just a couple of minutes to respond, because afterwards we want the rest of the audience to participate as well. They want to make a lot of questions to you. So, Eva, please.
So we are going to start with the general topic of moving from welfare to rights, shifting paradigms. And there I wanted to kind of touch upon an aspect that David mentioned in his presentation, which is the idea that perhaps certain concepts of intrinsic value and dignity may provide some basis for future rights development. So I was wondering, if that is the case, then what is still the added value of the rights discourse, and what is the significance of the explicit recognition of animal rights, and also pointing to the OJA bill and Leslie's presentation yesterday about the standing aspect, because that's, I think, something that came forward a lot in the discussions, that rights is also about having the standing to go to court. So maybe, David, you could shortly start with a reflection on this?
On that, yes. So, I mean, so my presentation wasn't meant to be against recognition of animal rights legislation or in constitutions, for example, like the Finnish proposal. I mean, I think where that's possible, that's important and that's significant. And why is it significant? Well, I mean, firstly, some people will just accept this, but I think the fact is that animals have entitlements in their own right. That notion is very important. And that they make claims on us, that's central, and that we have direct obligations towards them. Those are central ideas around the notion of a right. There is an attitudinal difference to having a right from simply being benevolent to someone, right, and being nice. There are people who've defended this, right? So a student came up to me recently and said to me, well, I think we must be nice to animals, but as sort of, from this idea of we have dominion over them and we need to guard them well. But I think a rights bearer notion is a different one to that. It actually recognizes them as beings who are deserving of respect. And recognizing rights, I think, importantly, will not avert trade-offs. And we are far removed from societies that are willing to relinquish exploitation of animals. We heard even on the Finnish proposal, I mean, Finland isn't about to end hunting. It isn't about to end meat eating. So it's not alone going to be the silver bullet in that respect, but it will give a symbolic expressive effect, and that would be a strong basis for understanding animals as rights bearers. It will be that interests, hopefully, in order to justify that an exploitation practice against animals, it's going to be harder to justify that, or at least you're going to have to adopt some kind of less restrictive means in some respect. But as I've said, I mean, I think we should be wary about placing all our eggs into one basket, so to speak, in relation to the rights idea. This idea is important. It's galvanized the movement. It's critical. We should also recognize that animals are deserving of being rights bearers. but also we need to work within our context and recognize that we may be able to achieve many of the achievements that we can get through rights through some other means.
Thanks, David. I reckon, Ruud, that this aligns with your policy work and the way you explained your approach in lobbying of being welfare focused, but leading to some outcomes that could be described as rights-based. Do you agree with this approach?
Yes, but well, first of all, I fully agree with what David just said. And again, I do not have the skills to be able to say whether something is a right or not. To be very honest, I came to this conference hoping that I would get a lot of answers and travel back home and knowing, now I know that is a right and that is not a right. Unfortunately, I will need to attend more of these conferences to get to that point. But what I learned is that with thin rights and thick rights and simple rights and fundamental rights, thin rights, the experts also call rights. And the simple rights are also simple rights. So I think that if I look at, for example, things like the ban on the fur production, that is, you're saying that we should abolish a system, right? So we're not saying, okay, well, the fur production can continue and the cages should be bigger or whatever, the temperature. No, we're saying, no, it's not going to happen. We're going to stop it, which is a reflection of I think, the moral convictions of our society, that people say that this kind of animal cruelty and animal suffering for luxury and non-essential purposes is no longer acceptable, should be stopped. And that, to me, feels very much like a right, but I'm not an expert.
Okay, thanks very much for these insights. Perhaps we can move to the next topic.
Yeah, or the three of you are okay? Which, yeah? Well, just, yeah, we can move to the next topic, of course. It's, there you go, it's mine. So this is another general question to all about communication and strategy working across disciplines. The question is the following. We have here an ethicist, a lobbyist or advocate, and a constitutional law professor. How do you think these different disciplines should interact with each other in relation to enshrining animal rights in legislation? So, work together, the question.
Well, I think that's vital. I mean, I think the first thing to talk about is a strategy. I think Nico raised this in the first presentation about, like, around animal experimentation. And I think one of the things we need to think, I was also having a chat over the tea break to Anthony about this and their work in their think tank, but actually about having a thinking about where are we going and a strategic thinking for the next. They have a time frame which is quite long, 40 to 60 years, but this is going to be a long game, right? And so how do we actually create that link, and how do we bring together the people with the expertise? And in my view, this is a multidisciplinary issue, and that I mean, we need also, I think it doesn't say science here, but I think science, in my experience, actually lobbying, the science plays an important role. I was very involved in the moratorium that was placed on the culling of elephants in South Africa. There was a sort of discourse in South Africa that there were too many elephants, and they would go out and just mow down whole groups of elephants. And it was absolutely horrific and traumatic. And we managed to get a moratorium, and then eventually a policy that it would only be done as a matter of last resort, and there would have to be alternatives. There's various other forms of contraception and various other things that can be used. And we found that a lot of the strategies that worked were very much scientific based, that actually showing that this kind of notion of culling actually keeps the reproduction rate of elephants, for example, at the highest rate possible. And so you're going to have to continually do this all the time because they're going to keep reproducing. And so it's better to actually develop alternatives that would achieve, stop having to do this as well. So I think but I also think it is important, I should say this, to inject ethics into the discussion. So I think there is a temptation to make all the arguments from the self-interest of humans about why it's a good idea to not do these things. And I think actually that there's a voice that needs to be there, and it's a critical voice, that we don't cede the ground alone to that strategic self-interested voice. So there is, we may have to be, and I don't know, Ruud probably can tell you many stories of engaging with legislators in the EU, I imagine, and also of why it's in their interests or something, or human interests, why our health, for instance, with zoonotic diseases will be affected if we don't in some ways protect animals. But I think at the same time, there's a critical role for maintaining the ethical argument as well. And that argument must be made in the public sphere, because it's an argument which is about shifting the consciousness of our society in relation to animals. And that's the argument that's ultimately going to create, I think, the long-standing social shift that we need.
So legal reform at the same time continue the ethic narrative, right? Richard?
Yes, I haven't had a lot of experience of working from within academia and finding it difficult to communicate with different parts of the rest of academia. That's not been my experience. My experience has been working with the politicians. I mean, to quickly tell the story that we didn't get a lot of help from the lawyers in Britain for forwarding the rights of, or the interests of animals. And shortly before she died, I had a conversation with Paula Sparks, who is also much missed. And we agreed that it was partly the lawyers' traditional closeness to the hunting and shooting people in this country that had slowed down the lawyers' responses in this country, historically speaking. And this is very sad. And so we actually gave up rather on the lawyers. About 40 years ago, we gave up on the lawyers in this country. We'd always found that the American lawyers were slightly more helpful. And Steve Wise was a wonderful example. And we've got a very distinguished lawyer sitting up there. I can see his heckles are beginning to rise. That's David Thomas. And my good old friend of many years, I have to say. But of course there are exceptions like David, like Paula, but we made it. I got together with 2 or 3 other people like Brian Davis and Douglas Houghton and others, and we went straight to the senior politicians. And we found this very positive reaction, really, from all senior politicians, heads of political parties, prime ministers, shadow prime ministers, etc. There's all, with one exception perhaps, a lot of tremendous heartfelt interest in animals. And our attempt has been to try to get them to be bold enough to show support for animal welfare in a country where the hunters themselves have been very clever at keeping them off the political agenda. So we've cut the corners and we've gone straight to the senior politicians who can make laws, and we've had a huge amount of success. Something like 60 new pieces of legislation in Brussels, engineered by our campaigners over the last 40 years.
That's super. So, well, happily we can say that we are working on having more lawyers on board.
Yes.
Fingers crossed.
Welcome.
Yeah. So, Ruud,
I have to say, I mean, can I just add this? I mean, I think your 2 leaders are absolutely outstanding. Raphael and Sean. Sean's disappeared now, has he? And it doesn't matter. Oh, he's up there, good. He moves around. And I mean, it's a tremendous occasion. This is a very important occasion. This is a very landmark conference, I think, where hopefully this group will set itself up as the academic authority on the difficult subject of animal rights in this country, and indeed in much of Europe. I think it deserves to be and should be. And to have it taken forward by this group would be a very satisfactory answer to the problem. Well done, everybody.
Hallelujah to that. Well, please. So, Ruud, you have some insights?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. What I see in Brussels is that we all have a role to play. Legislators, policymakers are sensitive to a few things. One is very clear ethical framing, I would call it. No theory. Please, no. But clear ethical framing is one. Scientific evidence is second, and public opinion is the third. Okay. And what we see now in the current political climate is that the voice of the industry is maybe the fourth one that we should include, because that's one of the things that many parliamentarians are now asking. So what does the industry think? Those are the things, and then if you look at that, then we all need to work together, and that's what we do. If we draft legislative proposals for people in Parliament, or work on amendments that they can use, then we work together with lawyers and scientists, and so it's no one can do this on their own.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. But theory sometimes, at least a little bit, it can help. We're still trying to think that.
Okay.
It starts with theory.
Yes.
It needs to be translated.
Of course.
So the ethical framework is the more practical application of a theory, or what is the ethical lens?
Yes.
Okay. Great.
Pass to the next one.
Yes, so the last topic we want to really look forward and just have a short last round of you all reflecting on what we can learn from the past and how we can translate that into a strategic way forward for embedding animal rights in legislation, to keep it to the conference theme. Perhaps we can start with David again.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I mean, I think it was a sort of question about, where are we at the present in relation to animal rights legislation, and I think there may be particular moments where it's possible to do this. We saw from Panama, for example. We often, when in constitution drafting, we often think of like there's a constitutional moment, and there may be opportunities in various societies where there's a kind of outcry or a horror about something, and you're able to get a ban, and we should do that, right? And we should think about those areas as well. And I think there's interesting to look at certain various levers. There may be less investment in general society in some practices rather than others. So I think that, for example, today circuses with animals are not generally favored. And so it's not too difficult to get an absolute ban for practices in that regard. The same is true for experimentation for cosmetic reasons, right? Technology may also help encourage social progress. And I think this is one of the things I didn't talk about. But I think some of our legislation, when I was talking about this kind of the platform, it's not just the concepts that we create, but in the legislation, one of our proposals, for instance, in South Africa, is to create duties to actually educate, for example, on humane education, right? And this is not so unusual because in South Africa, we're a country riven by problems of deep inequality from the past. And so our Equalities Act actually creates duties to engage and to actually promote equality directly. And so I think we need to think about those kinds of strategies where actually legislation engages, firstly places a duty. We need to think of the educational department, right? How are we going to change education? How are we shifting universities? And obviously the center and others are trying to engage with that. How are we looking at technology as an opportunity for, I mean, this was also from Nico's presentation, right? About an opportunity for replacement, but also perhaps potentially having one of the biggest effects that we will, Richard alluded to this, but I think of sort of alternative meats, etc., which perhaps if we are skeptical, as I am, that the majority of humans will give up meat eating, that might be one of the opportunities here that to avert large-scale suffering as well, and so synthetic meat and whatever these new developments that are taking place. So in some sense, again, a duty to look at investment in technology that actually investigates alternatives is also really important in some sense. Of course, I'm worried about this argument because in some senses it says that animal rights can be recognized when they do not require too much of humans, right? Or it's not in the human interest. And that's precisely the kind of argument that animal rights rejects. Animals are ends in themselves. They should be respected as such without having to find reasons why ending their exploitation will have little impact on humans. But the problem is that unlike many marginalized groups, animals cannot participate directly in advocacy for their rights in the same way that progress has happened in relation to other groups. Now, I should say we should also look at other successful examples, right? So obviously there was example here, long standing back around slavery, but we look at, for example, in South Africa, we look at strategic, and we think about this a lot, about litigation, like what are the kinds of success stories, right? So you have an example, my PhD student today, Ilabaca Gupta, will be presenting at the PhD workshop about the Indian example. But you have, for example, the Indian Supreme Court recognizing in Nagaraja, in 2013, roughly, rights for animals. And then 10 years later, there's a backtracking, right? And so that's very deeply disturbing. We don't want that kind of thing to happen, right? And so what you want to do is you want to kind of do, so the other successful story we had from South Africa, for instance, was around LGBT rights. So the LGBT movement thought through very carefully, what do we do? The first step was not to, South Africa was the first constitution to prohibit discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation, right? We could have gone first and argued for same-sex marriage. That would have been an extremely unwise legal strategy. So the first step was to decriminalize same-sex relationships, right? It was still criminalized. The next step was to start piecemeal finding rights of partners for one another, right? And so there was a recognition of a right to bring a partner into the country, a recognition to put your partner, same-sex partner, on the medical aid, and various kind of rights. And the court developed jurisprudence, it developed statements over time, which essentially said various positive things. And then we went about 10 years later, and then there was a marriage case. The court had already said so many things that it wasn't such a big step to take the marriage step, right? And so South Africa became, I think, the 5th country in the world, the only country on the African continent still to recognize same-sex marriage, right? We need to find similar strategies, right? And it's not easy. There's a huge temptation. I would love to take on some of the big meat industry practices. And from a lobbying point of view, we should be doing that. But if we're thinking about incremental development, we may want, certainly from a court point of view, we may want to look at how do we invite courts or how do we invite legislatures to get in the door some of these important developments, which then can create the foundation for future developments and then eventually recognize the bigger things that we want to achieve. It is very hard. It's hard ethically. I struggle with this because a case, I think one of the examples that was going to be asked, what case would you take? And I would love to take a case to ban battery cages, to ban sow stalls, and these kinds of examples, right, which affect so many animals and they suffer so terribly. But if we go directly to those cases, right, they're likely to fail. And so we need to go for cases perhaps which will invite sort of legal development, which can eventually lead to, hopefully, a more humane world for all animals.
Perhaps may I add something to the question so you can also a little bit reflect on that. But because we have been working for many years, most of us, and of course some even more years, have seniority of experience in these topics. But in the last few decades, we can say that we had a world that we all knew how it was moving, some conflicts around, etc. But now we're facing probably a more and more and more complicated, for humans actually, for nature and of course for animals. Climate change, potential wars are happening. So I would like you to think or reflect a little bit on that part of the game changing in the future prospects, if it's possible.
Me.
All of you, but let's start with.
Yes, I mean, I think it's the world is in an interesting situation. We've got two very strange men influencing events.
At least.
At least two. I mean, I'm interested in them as a psychologist, and I think we probably ought to become more interested in the psychology of people applying for senior posts in democratic political countries. There are people who really should never have qualified for being taken seriously. But then how can you do that with remaining democratic? But I mean, I do think there are people floating around now who shouldn't really be in politics, but are. How can you democratically deal with that problem? So that's probably the most advanced and difficult suggestion I would like to consider. But I think what we've seen in the last 40 years as regards animals is the fact that Brown Davis's contribution in always going to talk to the leader, to the top, to the president or prime minister of every country. And that's what he did, really. And it was remarkably successful. If it wasn't the president himself who was concerned when he was told about cruelty to dogs in preparation for food, then it was his wife who became concerned. And this is why Brown, when he went for dinners with leading politicians, would always take photographs so he could show the wife or the girlfriend, and they acted. And so it's a very interesting and incredible success of Brown Davis, who was this instinctive Welshman who had got his instincts right on that, was to try and bring in the wife as well. And that, well, because the husband was often a tyrant, and he wasn't a particularly good, obvious example. But if you got the wife involved, you didn't feel she was part of a tyrant's regime. She could contribute, and she did. And there were, I mean, it wasn't just that case, it was a lot of others as well. Anyway, putting animals into politics is what I've been doing for the last 40 years. And that phrase is not mine, it's Lord Houghton's, Douglas Houghton, the very distinguished statesman, really, who got involved with us 40 years ago. He's also has been dead 20 years now. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much. And Ruud, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so you're asking for a reflection on the current political climate and what that...
No, I mean, it's adding this to the general question that Eva...
Just a reflection
Yeah,
on the future strategy.
What do you see as to way forward, future strategies, etc.?
Given the
Yeah, of
situation.
course. Adding
Yes.
that component to
Right.
the future.
Okay, so
questions.
yeah, I can say something about the EU because that's what I know best. Can't speak about other parts of the world, but in the EU, fundamental rights for animals are not going to happen in the next couple of years. I'm pretty sure of that. That doesn't mean that the rights like outcomes or the simple, the thin rights that can't happen, and I think that they can be very important in the road towards more fundamental rights. But for us, I can tell you that our strategy has changed because of the recent political developments. So it's much more. We were increasing the activities on industry, corporate engagement and mobilization. So, for example, on animal testing, we have the animal-free safety assessment collaboration with companies like Unilever and Procter & Gamble and L'Oreal, who join us in convincing policymakers, regulatory bodies that we should phase out of animal testing. So that kind of stuff that will get more emphasis because it's what the policymakers are looking at the moment. They don't want to do anything to hurt or make things more complicated for the industry. The second thing is that we are linking, and I heard other speakers talk about that yesterday too, linking it to other topics like biodiversity, nature conservation, public health, zoonotic diseases, for example, but also things like national pride and cultural heritage, which in some countries in the European Union could absolutely work. So if we can link it to something like that, then we can be effective. And the third one is that we're investing a lot more now in studies, economic studies, scientific evidence, white papers by think tanks to convince the policymakers that we still need to do something for the animals.